Welcome back to the If You Are podcast. If you are new here, my name is Alexa, and this podcast is mainly about my faith, but I do sprinkle in a little bit of my personal life here and there, but it is mainly about my faith. So yeah, welcome. So I feel like the Lord was really calling me to talk about Psalms 24 today. A really short passage. It's only like 10 verses, so I got my notes, and let's just get into it. We're just going to get right into it. So the way I'm going to go about it is I'm going to just read the whole thing. So once I read the whole thing, then we're just going to go over it, and I'm going to just kind of break it down verse by verse. Psalms 24, the earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord, for he laid its foundation on the seas and established it on the rivers. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not appealed to what is false, and who has not sworn deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who inquire of him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, you gates, rise up, ancient doors. Then the King of glory will come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates. Rise up, ancient doors. Then the King of glory will come in. Who is he, this King of glory? The Lord of armies. He is the King of glory. So, there's a lot of repetition going on here, if you notice at the end. But we're going to start from the beginning. So this psalm, it's a psalm by David. David was a noble, successful king, but of a relatively small and insignificant kingdom. So David is the one speaking here in Psalms 24. And most of what he's saying here in this psalm is like very declarative. So it's like he's saying it with confidence, because if you notice at the end, lift up your head, you gates, it almost repeats the same thing. Like he almost repeats the same thing like 3 times at the end. So he's being very declarative in the sense of like, wake up. Like that's what it almost seems like wake up. So for verse 1, it wasn't enough for David to say that the entire earth belonged to the Lord. He added that all its fullness also belonged to him. It's difficult to think of a more sweeping statement of God's ownership. The fullness of the earth means its harvest, its wealth, its life, or its worship. In all these senses, the Most High God is possessor of all. There is a sense in which the world belongs to Satan. Satan is called the God of this age. And when he tempted Jesus with the promise of giving him the kingdoms of this world, Jesus did not question the devil's ability to do so. Yet Satan can only do anything at God's allowance. So God's ultimate ownership is true. God's ownership of the earth extends to the people who live upon it. Through the rights of creation and continuing provision, God has a claim upon every person who has ever lived. For the Lord to have ownership over all of us, I think is a beautiful thing. And I think sometimes people think of it as like, oh, God wants to control us and he wants to make us robots. No, he doesn't. He doesn't want to make us robots. He doesn't want us to do anything for him at his own convenience, like that's only going to serve him. There's even a verse in the Bible where it says, he didn't come to be served. He came to serve. God isn't here to just make you a robot and just be like, do this and do this and do that and do that with no context whatsoever, with no purpose behind it. And I talked about it in like another podcast that God gives us purpose, that everything we do every season has a purpose to be able to cultivate something beautiful with him, such as a relationship with him. He put us on this earth to reconcile with him. But because he's so loving, he gave us that free will to do whatever we want. So we have to make that choice on our own if we want to receive him in our hearts or not. But ultimately, God gives all of us that opportunity. He gives everyone that opportunity. He has a claim upon every person who has ever lived. Even if you don't believe in God, like he still believes in you. Verse 2, for he laid its foundation on the seas and established it on the rivers. God has the right to the earth and all who dwell upon it because he created both it and them. Like he laid the foundation of the earth for us to live a life to its fullness. He even thought about us in that, like, because it's like God knew that he was going to place us on this earth before we even knew. If he really truly wanted to, he didn't have to do that. He could have just lived there on his own. He could have just created the whole earth to live on it by himself. But no, he said, I'm going to make men and women, I'm going to make humans to live on the earth so that we can experience his creation. It's like he thought of us before we were ever going to think about him. And doing that, like, I see how selfless the Lord is. Like, he's not selfish, he's selfless. And for verse 2, David looks back to the creation account of Genesis 1 and remembers the creation of the land in the midst of earth's waters on the third day of creation. Verse 3, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? So here, David is asking a question, like a genuine question. And I love when people in the Bible ask questions because, like, as people, we have questions every day. So in verse 3, David is asking a genuine question. He's asking, who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? Basically, verse 3, in simple terms, he's asking, what are the things that a person should have or do to be right with God? That's basically what he's asking. In light of God's sovereign ownership of the earth and all who live upon it, David wondered exactly who had the right to stand before God. This wasn't about mountain climbing or hill ascending ability, but about the right to come before God. When he's asking the question, like, he's not talking about, like, performance. When he's talking about hands, he's talking about outward actions. When he's talking about heart, a clean heart, he's talking about pure intentions. Like, how do we live up to that? So verse 3, David here clarified his previous question. David asked, who has the right to stand before God at his holy temple in the holy place? This is a question that used to concern mankind much more than it does in our present day. Where there was a time when men and women genuinely wondered what was required of them to make them right with God. Today, it seems the most asked question is something like, how can I be happy? Personal happiness is important, but it isn't more important than being in right relationship with our Creator and our Provider. David not only asked an important question, but the most important question. So Psalms is in the Old Testament, and in the Old Testament, there was things that people were required to have to be right with God. And so that's why in verse 4, David says, the one who has clean hands and a pure heart. How can you always 100% have pure intentions and always have clean hands? You can't. We have all done something that has given us, like, hands that are not clean. And we've all done something with not the purest of intentions. This speaks of a man or woman who is pure in both their actions and intentions. This one can ascend the hill of the Lord and stand in his holy place. David already established God ruled the earth. Now he declared that God rules the earth on a moral foundation. He is concerned with the moral behavior of mankind. Clean hands are important for good hygiene, but this speaks of much more than washing with water. So in verse 4, we're seeing a list of things. We're seeing someone who has clean hands, someone who has a pure heart, someone who has not appealed to what is false, and someone who has not sworn deceitfully. So in the Old Testament, this is what would have been required for someone who wanted to be right in the eyes of God. They had to have clean hands, a pure heart. They can't appeal to what is false, and someone who is not sworn deceitfully. It's easy to look at this list and see that my hands are not always clean. My heart is not always pure. Idolatry can be both subtle and stubborn in my heart. I also find it too easy to make promises with at least a tinge of deceit. But fortunately enough, God established a better covenant, a new covenant, through the person and work of Jesus. Under the new covenant, we see that Jesus is the one who has clean hands and a pure heart. Perfectly so. Jesus has never lifted up his soul to an idol and has never sworn deceitfully. In his righteousness given to all who believe, we can ascend his holy hill and stand in his holy place. So here, it's like kind of a shift, because at first we start to really evaluate ourselves and be like, okay, so we got to do this, and we got to do this to be right in the eyes of God. But we don't realize that verse 4 is really foreshadowing Jesus, because he then establishes a new covenant where this is not required of us. Because I mean, obviously, it's just not possible to always have a clean heart or clean hands. We're flawed. Everybody has stolen something in their life. Everybody has cursed. Like, we've all cursed once. Like, like, the list goes on. Like, we've all done something or said something. So for this to be required of us now, we would die. And we would all go to hell. I don't know what else to say. But it's true. I don't know why I said it like that. I mean, we can strive to be like that. We can strive to do all those things, but we're going to fail. Nevertheless, David's principle is also accurate under the new covenant in this sense. The conduct of one's life is a reflection of his fellowship with God. As John wrote, we might say that under the old covenant, a righteous walk was the precondition for fellowship with God. Under the new covenant, a righteous walk is the result of fellowship with God, founded on faith. Yet under both covenants, God cares very much about the moral conduct of mankind, especially those who identify themselves as his people. So like I said in the old covenant, this is what was required of us, to have all these things. And now we're looking through the lens of what we now have, which is the new covenant. So looking through the eyes of the new covenant, all these things, a clean hands, a pure heart, who has not appealed to what is false, it's not required of us. We don't have to be clean before God, but these things are the result of us having a relationship with God. Having clean hands, having pure heart, not appealing to what is false, not idolizing. It's the natural result of living according to God's wise order. So now here we're talking about a received righteousness that comes from the God of salvation. So now we're not necessarily talking about having to do all these things. I want to call it following the rules, because when you don't understand why God calls us to when you don't understand why God calls us to not do certain things, you look at them as rules. Kind of like a parent. As a parent, you need to tell your child why you shouldn't do something and why. Because what happens if you don't tell them why, then they don't get the full context. They're not going to understand, and they're going to do it anyways. But when we come into an actual relationship with God and we truly get to know him, and we get to know why he said certain things, and why we can't do certain things, and why certain things are not good, and we start to read things in full context when we read the word, then we truly get an understanding of okay, now I get it. Now I know why. And we don't fall for all of the false things that you think in your head that we need to do to be right before God, like buying a bunch of candles and doing a whole ritual and getting a cleanse from a lady who's claiming that God is talking to her. I don't know how to say it any better. When you truly know God and you read the word and you read it in its full context, you know why God calls us to not do certain things, and why. God is not going to leave us hanging. He's not just going to be figure it out. That's why we have the word, y'all. That's why we have the word. That's why we need to get into the word. And let me tell you something. And I'm just being reminded of this verse right now. My people perish for a lack of knowledge. You just don't know. You don't know. And this is why you need to read the word. Stop playing. Read the word. Stop playing. I'm telling you right now. There were so many, I'm telling you right now, if you don't read the word, you will never know God. Stop going to these people that are telling you, yeah, God is speaking through me and God wants me to tell. That's why you need to test it even says that in the Bible, test every spirit. Because you don't know where these people are getting this information from. Know God yourself. Stop going to these psychic ladies and stop going to your friend. Cultivate your own relationship with God. You want to know what my biggest pet peeve is? And this goes hand in hand with what I'm talking about. My biggest pet peeve is when somebody has a question for me, but they don't want to ask me. They want to tell somebody else to ask me. And that's what we do sometimes with God. We go through loopholes, and we just go through loopholes and we never get anywhere. And this is why you need to read the word. This is why you need to read the word. Because you're just going to be going through loopholes, and you're never going to get anywhere. It's in the word. And if it's not in the word, you can always ask God, and he will show you. And I'm just being reminded of that verse too that says, ask and you will receive, knock and the door will be open to you. Do you really think God is going to just be figure it out? No, God is not mute. He's not deaf. He speaks. Ask and you shall receive. Knock and the door will be open to you. Read your word. And if it's not in the word, then ask God. And I promise you that he will speak. I promise you that. I don't know why I decided to go on that rant, but I just did. Okay. God sets parameters and rules for a reason. Kind of like a child. A child doesn't know. A child doesn't know what they're doing. They have no conscience. They have no awareness. You have to watch them and lead them. And that's what the Lord wants to do with us. He wants to be the Lord over our life. He wants to lead us. He wants to guide us. He wants to counsel us. He wants to speak. He wants to answer questions. So when people want to look at the Bible and just talk about, oh, it's nothing but a bunch of rules. Have you read it? Have you read it in its full context? So for verse 5, when it says, he will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation, we're talking about a received righteousness. When we receive Christ in our heart, we open up ourselves to the process. And we're open into receiving whatever he has for us. And sometimes that means that he'll highlight certain things that we need to stop doing. God knows and cares about the moral behavior of men and women. He rewards those who honor him with their lives. This blessing may be understood sometimes in rewards that God grants to the obedient. Other times it may be understood as the natural result of living according to God's wise order. David here spoke in the idiom of the Old Covenant, where right standing with God might be assumed from the life of the obedient. At the same time, David wrote of a received righteousness that came from the God of his salvation. You might say that the obedient life spoken of in this psalm is the product of the received righteousness obtained by faith. The righteousness from the God of his salvation. When we receive Christ, we receive righteousness. We're right before God when we receive him by faith. And when we truly believe and recognize the need for him, that's when we're right standing with God. Verse 5, it says that we obtain these things by receiving Christ in our hearts by faith, when we truly believe and recognize the need for him. That's when we obtain clean hands and a pure heart. When we look at the finished work of what Jesus did at the cross for us, we don't have to be clean before God to get right with him. We just go to God. And he cleanses us. He cleanses our soul. He starts to just take things out of us that aren't meant to be there. He starts to take the scales off of our eyes and show us the truth. And he does that with such a gentleness. He's not going to condemn us. He just wants to restore us. Verse 6, such is the generation of those who inquire of him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. So this was David's way of identifying God's covenant people. The blessed and righteous ones have entered into covenant with God. The blessed and righteous ones do more than enter into covenant with God. They also pursue him with a continual seeking. This is something each generation must do. It talks about the continual seeking of him. It's a continuous journey. It's not just about having faith in a moment. It's choosing that over and over and over again. And that's also why it's called having a relationship with God, because it's a choice that we make for ourselves every day. And it's a choice that people who don't believe in Christ don't have. They don't believe that they have that choice to seek him every day because they don't believe in him. That's why we're called to cultivate and grow our relationship with God, because we grow onto him and we grow this clinginess and this dependence on him. And it's like we yield to that. It's not that we have to, because he wants to make us robots and he wants us to just be slaves to him. It's not that. It's like we yield to it because we remember that feeling and the freedom that we felt when we received Christ. Verse 7, lift up your heads, you gates, rise up ancient doors. Then the King of glory will come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. So when it says in verse 7, lift up your heads, you gates, rise up ancient doors, then the King of glory will come in. We're talking about what happens when somebody receives Christ. Then the King of glory will come in. It's kind of like that verse that I talked about earlier where ask you shall receive, knock and the door will be open to you. And I just believe that when we draw near to him, he draws near to us because he sees the need in our hearts. And he recognizes that because he created us and he knows us. You can be so deep in depression or whatever, and like your family, your friends, they won't even recognize it. They don't know. But it's like when you truly are desperate for like healing and you're desperate for peace and you know that your heart yearns for something more, it's like God recognizes that need and he knows, like I said, when we draw near to him, he draws near to us. When God is welcomed with open gates and doors, he is pleased to come in. The King of glory will meet with his people when approached correctly and the doors are opened onto him. See, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. This is Revelations 3:20. What I think, and this is just what I think of when I'm reading verse 7 and 8. Verse 8, who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. David notes that the same God who responds to man's welcome is still the King of glory. He is mighty in battle. His openness to man doesn't diminish his glory or might. One of the things that I really love about the Lord is just like the way he is so human and God at the same time. He really understands our emotions and he has so much humility to just stoop down and lift us up and to truly just give us unexplainable peace and to give us a pure love, and yet that still doesn't diminish who he is. And it's just repeating. The end of the psalm is just a lot of repetition, and repetition communicates emphasis. It is no small thing that this King of glory stoops down to receive men and even to be received by men. I feel like the ending of this psalm and the beginning just really stand out to me. In the beginning where it says, the earth and everything in it belongs to the Lord. And in the ending where it says, who is he? The King of glory, the Lord of armies, he is the King of glory. And it's like everything he did really had so much purpose tied to it. And we talk about the beginning about how he created everything and how he has ownership over everything. And then we come to the ending and it's like you realize that he is the King of glory and that all glory goes to him. And that there's nothing that we can ever take credit for. There's nothing that we can ever do to earn his love. It's like when we receive him, we receive his righteousness. We receive his love for us. Like God doesn't require anything of us. He just requires us to be honest with him. We don't have to perform. We don't have to earn. We don't have to go out of our way to do whatever ritual or routine to get his approval or acceptance. Like we just be. We just come as we are. We're not striving anymore. We're just yielding. Like we just yield to that naturally. Anyways, thank you guys for listening to the If You Are podcast. And I will have all my links down below for YouTube, Spotify, my Instagram, the podcast Instagram. I will have all that linked below. Thank you guys so much for listening. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.